The pounding on my door started before the sun even touched the ridge, not a polite knock, not a neighbor stopping by. Heavy, aggressive blows that echoed through the cabin walls like someone trying to break the place down. I rolled out of bed and stepped onto the porch, just as 3 black SUVs crawled up the dirt road that led to my off-grid cabin. Gravel crunched under their tires. Headlights cut through the morning fog hanging over the trees. 2 men in matching jackets jumped out and immediately started taking photos of everything around my property. My solar panels, my rainwater tanks, even the cedar siding of the cabin I had spent 2 years building with my own hands. Then the driver's door of the first SUV opened. Out stepped Victoria Halberg, the president of the Pine Hollow Ridge HOA, dressed like she was about to walk into a corporate boardroom instead of standing in the mud outside a mountain cabin. She looked around my land with open disgust. 14 acres of forest. Quiet. No neighbors in sight. Apparently, even that offended her. "Mr. Calder," she said sharply, waving a bright orange envelope in the air. "Your property is in violation of community standards." Before I could say a word, she shoved the envelope into my hand. Inside were pages of fines. Solar system violation. Rainwater collection violation. Exterior structure violation. Total amount due, $32,000. I stared at the paper, then back at her. "This land passed county permits months ago," I said, "and it's a mile away from your subdivision." Victoria didn't even blink. Her lips curled into the kind of smile people wear when they know they hold power over you. "Your land was annexed into Pine Hollow Ridge," she replied. "Which means your cabin, your solar panels, and whatever those tanks are," she gestured toward the rainwater system, "damaged the visual harmony of our community." The 2 men behind her kept snapping pictures like paparazzi documenting a crime scene. Then Victoria leaned a little closer. Her voice dropped just enough to make the threat personal. "If you don't comply," she said calmly, "we'll take your property." The words hit harder than the cold air around us. I looked down at the orange envelope again, at the ridiculous fines, at the official HOA letterhead printed across the top like a stamp of authority. At that moment, I honestly thought it was just intimidation. A bully in a business suit trying to scare a quiet homeowner into following her rules. I had no idea that envelope would start a war. A war that would end 30 days later with the entire HOA management company being fired and Victoria Halberg walking out of the neighborhood she thought she controlled. The SUVs eventually pulled away, their engines fading down the dirt road. But the orange violation notice stayed in my hand. The wind caught the corner of it, making the paper flap against my palm like a warning nailed to a coffin. And standing there on my own porch, staring out over the trees I'd worked so hard to protect, I realized something. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a paperwork mistake. It was a declaration of war. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The truth is, none of this started as a fight. When I bought that land, the last thing I wanted in my life was conflict. My name is Ethan Calder. I'm 53 years old, and for almost 3 decades I worked as an electrician across western Pennsylvania. Long days, early mornings, job sites covered in mud or snow, the kind of work where you come home exhausted but satisfied because you built something real. For most of my life, I had someone waiting at home, my wife Laura. She was the calm center of everything, the one who could make even the worst day feel manageable with nothing more than a quiet smile and a cup of coffee on the porch. Then 3 years ago, cancer took her from me. Ovarian cancer. Fast, brutal, unfair in the way those things always are. For months after she passed, the house we shared felt like a museum of memories I couldn't escape. Every room reminded me of the life we were supposed to keep living together. Eventually, I realized something. If I stayed there, I was never going to heal. So I sold the house. I packed what mattered, kept my tools, and started looking for land somewhere quiet, somewhere far enough away from the noise of town that I could breathe again. That's how I found the 14 acres outside a small place called Ridgeline Falls. It wasn't fancy, just forest and hills and a narrow dirt road winding up the ridge. But the moment I stepped onto that property, something inside me settled for the first time in months. No traffic, no streetlights, just wind in the trees and open sky. I bought the land a week later. Then I started building. For the next 2 years, that cabin became my entire world. I designed everything myself. A timber frame structure with thick cedar beams and wide windows facing the valley. I installed solar panels along the south side of the roof, ran battery storage in a small equipment shed, and built a rainwater collection system that fed into filtration tanks beside the cabin. It wasn't flashy, but it was solid. Independent. The kind of place where a man could wake up, drink coffee on the porch, and know he built every inch of what stood around him. For the first time since Laura passed, life felt quiet again, peaceful. The only neighbor close enough to see smoke from my chimney was a man named Andre Whitaker, who lived about half a mile across the ridge. Andre was a retired civil engineer who had turned an old Morton barn into a surprisingly comfortable home. The first time we met, he showed up carrying a six-pack and a toolbox. Figured anyone crazy enough to build a cabin out here might need a second pair of hands, he said with a grin. Andre became the closest thing I had to a neighbor after that. We'd help each other fix equipment, share tools, and sometimes sit on the ridge watching the sun drop behind the hills. For months, life stayed that simple. Then Pine Hollow Ridge elected a new HOA president, Victoria Halberg. At first, most of us barely noticed. The subdivision she ran sat farther down the mountain, a cluster of neat houses and paved streets that had nothing to do with our scattered ridge properties. Her emails started small. Community newsletters, reminders about landscaping standards, friendly updates about maintaining property values. I ignored most of them. Then the notices started. Andre was the first to mention it. One afternoon he walked over holding a letter that warned his greenhouse violated agricultural restrictions. The thing had been sitting on his property for nearly a decade without anyone saying a word. A week later, another neighbor, a retired teacher named Martin Keller, got fined over a wooden storage shed behind his house. That's when people started asking questions, because none of us on the ridge had ever agreed to be part of the Pine Hollow HOA. In fact, most of us had bought land out there specifically to avoid that kind of thing. But before anyone could figure out what was happening, the orange envelope appeared on my door. The one Victoria Halberg handed me that morning. When I opened it later that day, the list of violations went on for 3 pages. Solar power system, rainwater collection tanks, exterior structure materials. Even the natural cedar siding on my cabin somehow counted as a problem. But it wasn't the fines that made my stomach tighten. It was one single line buried halfway down the notice. According to Pine Hollow Ridge records, my land had been officially annexed into the HOA 2 years earlier, and somehow I had never been told. 2 days after Victoria Halberg showed up at my cabin with that orange envelope, I decided sitting around angry wasn't going to solve anything. So I drove down the mountain to Pine Hollow Ridge. The subdivision sat about a mile from my land, tucked behind a stone entrance sign and a row of perfectly trimmed hedges. Everything about the place looked polished and controlled. Identical mailboxes, identical driveways. Even the lawns looked like they had been measured with a ruler. At the center of it all sat the HOA clubhouse. I parked my truck outside and walked in carrying the violation notice. The moment I stepped through the door, the atmosphere hit me like walking into a courtroom. Long folding tables faced a raised desk at the front of the room. Several homeowners sat quietly in chairs, whispering among themselves. At the center of the table sat Victoria Halberg, dressed in another immaculate business outfit like she was presiding over a corporate board meeting instead of a neighborhood gathering. To her right sat a tall man in a navy suit I hadn't seen before. When I entered, Victoria glanced up, her expression shifting instantly into a practiced smile. "Mr. Calder," she said smoothly, "I was wondering when you'd show up." I walked forward and set the orange notice on the table. "We need to talk about this," I said. She didn't even glance down at the paper. "There's nothing to discuss," she replied calmly. "Your property is currently in violation of multiple Pine Hollow Ridge architectural standards." A murmur moved through the room. I felt every pair of eyes settle on me. "My cabin passed county inspection," I said, keeping my voice steady, "and my land sits nearly a mile outside your neighborhood." Victoria leaned back slightly in her chair. "That used to be true," she said. Then she slid a thick binder across the table toward me. Inside were pages of HOA documents, maps, and meeting minutes. 2 years ago," she continued, "the Pine Hollow Ridge community voted to annex the surrounding ridge parcels into the association boundary." She tapped one of the pages with a manicured finger. "That includes your 14 acres. Before I could respond, the man beside her stood up. "Marcus Doyle," he said, offering a brief nod. "Regional Property Manager for Summit Ridge Community Services." His voice had the smooth tone of someone used to delivering bad news without emotion. "Our firm oversees compliance for Pine Hollow Ridge," he continued. "And, according to our records, your property now falls fully under HOA jurisdiction." I stared at the documents. Annexation vote, architectural standards, compliance deadlines. Everything looked official, but none of it made sense. "You're telling me," I said slowly, "that my private land suddenly belongs to your HOA because of a vote I was never invited to?" Marcus folded his hands calmly. "The vote was conducted according to association bylaws. And now that the annexation is complete," Victoria added, "all properties within the boundary must comply with community guidelines." She flipped open another folder. Photographs of my cabin filled the pages, solar panels on the roof, rainwater tanks beside the shed, the cedar siding glowing in the sunlight. Victoria pointed at each one like she was presenting evidence in court. Unapproved solar installation, improper water collection systems, exterior materials inconsistent with community design standards. I felt heat rising in my chest. "That cabin took me 2 years to build," I said. "Every part of it passed county permits. And it sits in the middle of 14 acres of forest." Victoria didn't look impressed. "In Pine Hollow Ridge," she replied coolly, "individual preferences come second to community standards." Then her tone hardened. "If you wish to remain in compliance, you will need to remove the solar system and bring the structure exterior into alignment with HOA guidelines." "And if I don't?" I asked. Victoria smiled again. "But there was nothing friendly about it. Then the association will begin enforcement procedures." Marcus Doyle leaned slightly forward. "Which may include a lien against your property." For a moment the room was silent. Then a chair scraped behind me. Andre Whitaker stood up from the back row. He had been sitting quietly the whole time, listening. "That's ridiculous," Andre said. "Ethan's cabin isn't even visible from your subdivision." Victoria turned slowly toward him. "Mr. Whitaker," she said. Andre crossed his arms. "You're trying to regulate land that's been independent for decades," he continued. "And you're doing it with fines and threats." Victoria's expression cooled several degrees. She looked around the room before answering. "In every community," she said carefully, "there are standards that protect property values." Her gaze returned to Andre. "And occasionally there are residents who choose not to respect those standards." She paused long enough to make sure everyone was listening. "People who don't fit this community's expectations," she said quietly, "don't belong here." The words hung in the air like smoke. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. I realized then that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a paperwork dispute. Victoria Halberg wasn't trying to enforce rules. She was trying to force people like me off the ridge. The meeting ended soon after. But 2 days later, things got worse. 3 more violation notices arrived in my mailbox. Additional fines. Additional penalties. The total amount now stood at $46,000. And at the bottom of the final notice was a line that made my stomach drop. The Pine Hollow Ridge HOA had scheduled a board vote. A vote to begin foreclosure proceedings on my property. After that meeting, things didn't calm down. They escalated. Within a week, it felt like Pine Hollow Ridge had turned the entire ridge into enemy territory. The first thing I noticed were the trucks. White SUVs with the Summit Ridge Community Services logo started driving up the dirt road near my property almost every day. Sometimes they would crawl slowly past the edge of my land, cameras pointed toward the cabin like they were documenting a crime scene. Other times they stopped outright. One afternoon I stepped outside and caught one of the drivers standing beside his vehicle, taking photos of my solar panels through a zoom lens. When he saw me watching, he didn't even look embarrassed. He just climbed back into the SUV and drove off. 2 days later, another envelope arrived. More fines, more violations. And it wasn't just me anymore. Andre walked over one evening carrying a letter of his own. "They're calling my greenhouse an agricultural structure," he said, shaking his head. "Apparently Pine Hollow Ridge doesn't allow farming operations." Andre's greenhouse was a simple glass frame he used to grow tomatoes and herbs. It had been standing on his property for nearly 8 years. Nobody had ever complained about it before. Now suddenly it was a violation. A day after that, Martin Keller got hit next. Martin lived farther down the ridge in a small cedar house surrounded by pine trees. He had spent most of his life teaching history at a high school in Ridgeline Falls. His crime? A wooden storage shed behind his garage. The HOA notice gave him 30 days to remove it or face escalating fines. By the end of the week, nearly every property owner on the ridge had received something. Violation letters, warning notices, threats of penalties. At the same time, Pine Hollow Ridge residents started receiving newsletters from the HOA board. Andre showed me one he found stuffed into his mailbox. The headline read, "Protecting Community Standards." The article inside claimed that unregulated structures on the outer ridge threatened Pine Hollow's property values. It talked about maintaining visual harmony and preventing the neighborhood from becoming an uncontrolled rural zone. What it didn't mention was that the properties they were complaining about had existed long before most of the subdivision houses were built. Victoria Halberg was rewriting the story, turning longtime landowners into the problem, and apparently it was working. A few days later, I decided to attend another HOA meeting, not to argue, just to talk. I figured if people heard the truth directly from me, maybe the tension would settle down. The clubhouse was packed that night. More homeowners than I'd ever seen before sat in the folding chairs facing the board table. Victoria Halberg stood at the front like she was delivering a press conference. When she saw me walk in, the faintest smirk crossed her face. The meeting started with routine announcements, budget updates, landscaping contracts. Then Victoria cleared her throat and looked directly at me. "Before we continue," she said, "I believe it's important to address a growing concern affecting Pine Hollow Ridge." Several heads turned toward where I was sitting. Victoria clasped her hands together on the table. "Certain individuals living on recently annexed ridge parcels," she continued, "have chosen to openly disregard community standards." The way she said certain individuals made it clear exactly who she meant. "They have refused to correct architectural violations," she added, "and are attempting to undermine the integrity of our neighborhood." I stood up. "That's not true," I said. "My property follows county regulations and—" Victoria raised a hand sharply. "You've already made your position clear, Mr. Calder." Her tone had lost every trace of politeness. Then Marcus Doyle stood up beside her. "As of today," he announced, "the association will begin increasing violation penalties on a weekly basis until compliance is achieved." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some homeowners looked uncomfortable. Others looked curious. But nobody said anything. The meeting ended shortly afterward. I left feeling like the ground beneath the ridge had shifted, but the worst moment didn't happen until the next morning. Andre drove up to my cabin just after sunrise. He didn't bother knocking. He walked straight onto the porch holding a crumpled piece of paper. "You need to see this," he said. The flyer had been taped to the community bulletin board near the subdivision entrance. Across the top, in bold black letters, were the words, "Non-compliant Ridge squatters." Below that was a list of properties. Mine, Andre's, Martin Keller's, and a few others. According to the flyer, we were refusing to follow community guidelines and putting Pine Hollow Ridge at risk. I stared at the page for a long moment. Then I looked up at Andre. "That's when it finally clicked," I said quietly. This wasn't about solar panels. It wasn't about sheds or greenhouses or siding colors. This was about power. Victoria Halberg wasn't enforcing rules. She was trying to control the ridge, and anyone who didn't fall in line was going to be pushed out. That night, just after dark, Andre came back to the cabin. This time he looked different. Serious. He knocked once, then stepped inside holding a thick folder of documents. "Ethan," he said quietly, "I think their annexation vote might be illegal." Andre spread the folder across my kitchen table like he was laying out evidence in a trial. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The cabin was quiet except for the faint hum of the battery system in the utility room and the wind pushing through the trees outside. A single lamp lit the papers between us. Photocopies of county records, HOA meeting minutes, and property maps Andre had spent the entire afternoon digging up. "You're going to want to look at this part first," he said, sliding one sheet toward me. At the top of the page was the heading, "Pine Hollow Ridge Special Board Meeting, Annexation, Vote." The date was 2 years earlier. The meeting notes described a vote by the HOA membership to expand the community boundary to include several undeveloped ridge parcels. My land, Andre's land, Martin Keller's property, and a handful of others scattered along the mountain. According to the document, the proposal had passed by a single vote. I leaned back in my chair. "So they voted themselves control over land that didn't belong to them," I said. "Pretty much," Andre replied. "But here's the part that doesn't add up." He pointed to the voting tally near the bottom of the page. Total votes cast, 75 total, eligible homes in the subdivision as 74s. I stared at the numbers. Then I counted them again. "Wait," I said slowly, "that can't be right." Andre nodded. "That's exactly what I thought." The math didn't work. Even if every homeowner in Pine Hollow Ridge had voted, which almost never happens in HOA meetings, the total should have been 74, not 75. "That means someone added a vote that shouldn't exist," I said. "Exactly." For the first time since Victoria Halberg showed up at my cabin, a small spark of hope flickered in my chest. Because if the vote that expanded the HOA boundary had been fraudulent, then the entire annexation might be invalid. Which meant something very important. Victoria Halberg might never have had authority over my land in the first place. The next morning, Andre and I drove 2 hours south to Harrisburg. Andre knew a real estate attorney there who had handled land disputes before, a woman named Lydia Cross. Her office sat on the second floor of an old brick building overlooking the Susquehanna River. When we walked in carrying our stack of documents, Lydia greeted us with the kind of calm curiosity that comes from years of dealing with complicated property cases. "Let's see what you've got," she said. For the next hour, she read through the annexation records in silence. Every so often, she would underline a section or flip back to double-check a page. Andre and I barely spoke. Finally, Lydia leaned back in her chair and tapped a pen against the table. "Well," she said slowly, "this is interesting." She slid the meeting minutes toward us. "The annexation vote passed by a single vote margin," she said, "which means the accuracy of that tally is critical." She pointed to the number again. 75 votes. 74 homes. You can't legally cast more votes than eligible members, she continued. If that tally is incorrect or manipulated, the annexation itself could be invalid. Andre folded his arms. So the HOA never had authority over the ridge parcels. Potentially, Lydia replied. Then she flipped open another folder. That's not the only thing I noticed. She handed us a document listing the HOA's management contract. The name at the top read Summit Ridge Community Services SQ. Marcus Doyle's company. According to this agreement, Lydia said, Summit Ridge receives a percentage of all enforcement fines collected by the HOA. Andre frowned. What kind of percentage? 10%, Lydia answered. The room went quiet. I did the math in my head. My fines alone had already reached $46,000. 10% of that was $4,600, and I wasn't the only one being fined. Andre's greenhouse, Martin's shed, several other ridge properties, all suddenly facing escalating penalties. That means the more violations they issue, I began. The more money they make, Lydia finished. Suddenly, Victoria Halberg's aggressive enforcement campaign made perfect sense. The patrol trucks, the weekly fines, the threats of foreclosure. It wasn't about protecting community standards. It was about generating revenue. Victoria played the role of HOA president. Marcus Doyle's company collected the money. And the ridge properties had become their newest target. I leaned forward in my chair, anger mixing with something else now. Clarity. This whole thing was designed to expand their fine pool, I said. Lydia nodded. It certainly looks that way. Andre shook his head slowly. So they annexed our land through a suspicious vote, then started issuing violations to increase their profits. Lydia closed the folder and folded her hands. That's what the evidence suggests. For the first time since this mess started, I felt the balance shift slightly. Victoria Halberg thought she had found an easy target, a quiet widower living alone in the woods. Someone she could bully with paperwork and legal threats. But now the paperwork was pointing in a different direction. And Lydia Cross seemed to realize it too. She leaned back in her chair, a small smile appearing on her face as she closed the file. If we prove this annexation vote was fraudulent, she said calmly, you won't just stop the fines. She looked directly at me. You could remove the entire board. The moment Lydia Cross confirmed that the annexation vote might be fraudulent, the entire situation changed. Up until that point, Andre and I had been reacting to Victoria Halberg's attacks, scrambling to answer violation notices, trying to defend ourselves against fines and threats. Now, we finally had something stronger than anger. We had leverage. But Lydia made one thing very clear before we left her office. Having evidence and proving it are two different things, she said. She explained that if we wanted to challenge the annexation legally, we would need more than one suspicious vote tally. We needed witnesses, records, and proof that the vote had been manipulated. And ideally, we needed support from other homeowners. Because if the HOA board realized what we were doing, they would fight back hard, so Andre and I started quietly. We began by reaching out to the other ridge property owners who had been targeted by violation notices. Martin Keller was the first to join us. The retired teacher listened carefully as we explained what Lydia had discovered about the vote count. By the time we finished, he leaned back in his chair and said something that stuck with me. I knew something smelled wrong, he said, but I didn't realize it went this deep. Over the next several days, Andre and I started knocking on doors throughout Pine Hollow Ridge. Not loudly, not publicly. Just quiet conversations, sharing the documents, explaining the numbers, showing people exactly how the annexation vote had supposedly passed with 75 ballots from 74 homes. At first, many residents looked skeptical. HOA politics can be messy, but most people assume the leadership is at least following the rules. Then something unexpected happened. People started bringing their own evidence. One afternoon, a woman named Rachel Alvarez invited us into her kitchen. Rachel had lived in Pine Hollow Ridge for nearly 10 years. She ran a small accounting business from home and had attended the annexation meeting 2 years earlier. When we told her what we were investigating, she went silent for a moment. Then she stood up and walked into the next room. When she came back, she was holding a printed stack of emails. "These came from the HOA board before the annexation vote," she said. Andre and I leaned forward. The emails were from Victoria Halberg and several other board members, urging residents to protect the community's long-term property value by supporting the expansion. But one line jumped out immediately. One of the messages warned that homeowners who opposed the annexation could face future compliance reviews. Rachel shook her head. "It felt like pressure at the time," she said, "but I never thought it might actually be illegal." That wasn't the only discovery. A few days later, another homeowner told us something even more interesting. The former HOA president, the man who had overseen the annexation vote, no longer lived in Pine Hollow Ridge, but he hadn't disappeared. He was now working for Summit Ridge Community Services, Marcus Doyle's management company. When Andre heard that, he just stared at the paper in disbelief. So the guy who helped expand the HOA territory now worked for the company collecting fines from the expansion, he said. It didn't look like a coincidence. Meanwhile, Lydia Cross moved forward with the legal side of the fight. She filed a motion with the county court requesting a formal review of the annexation vote. That step alone sent shockwaves through the HOA leadership. Within days, Victoria Halberg escalated her attacks. More violation notices arrived. The weekly fines increased again. Then the HOA board made their boldest move yet. A formal notice appeared in my mailbox announcing a special HOA meeting. On the agenda was a vote authorizing foreclosure proceedings against my property. They were planning to take my cabin, the place I had built with my own hands. But when I showed the notice to Lydia, she didn't panic. Instead, she smiled. "That meeting might actually help us," she said. Andre and I exchanged confused looks. "How?" I asked. Lydia leaned forward across her desk. "If enough homeowners attend," she explained, "the HOA bylaws allow members to call for a leadership vote." "You mean replace the board?" Andre asked. "Exactly." Victoria Halberg believed she had the community behind her. But she had no idea how many people were now questioning the annexation vote. For the next 2 weeks, Andre and I worked harder than I had since building the cabin. We knocked on doors. We handed out copies of the vote tally. We showed residents the emails Rachel had saved. We explained the management company's 10% cut from every violation fine. The more people learned, the angrier they became. One homeowner told us he had paid nearly $8,000 in HOA fines over the past year. Another admitted he had voted for the annexation because the board told him it was necessary to protect the neighborhood. Little by little, the truth spread through Pine Hollow Ridge, and all the while, Victoria Halberg continued behaving like she had already won. Her patrol trucks kept driving the Ridge Road. More warning letters appeared. More threats. She believed the foreclosure vote would finally remove the problem. But what she didn't realize was that every one of those threats was pushing more homeowners to our side. By the end of the second week, the atmosphere in the neighborhood had completely changed. People who had barely spoken to each other before were now comparing notes about violation notices and HOA meetings. Andre looked at me one evening as we finished another round of door knocking. "You feel that?" he said. "What?" I asked. The shift. He wasn't wrong. For the first time since this started, the HOA board wasn't controlling the narrative anymore. The residents were starting to ask questions, and Victoria Halberg had no idea the ground was moving under her feet. The annual HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday night. Victoria believed she was about to remove me from the community for good. But she had absolutely no idea what was waiting for her when those doors opened. By the time Thursday night arrived, The atmosphere around Pine Hollow Ridge felt like the air before a thunderstorm. Heavy, electric, waiting for something to break. Andre and I drove down the ridge road just after sunset. As we approached the clubhouse, the first thing we noticed was the parking lot. It was completely packed. Cars lined both sides of the street. Pickup trucks were squeezed into corners of the gravel lot, and a few residents had even parked along the grass near the entrance. I had never seen this many people show up for an HOA meeting before. Normally, those meetings were half-empty affairs attended by the same handful of board members and a few bored homeowners. Tonight felt different. Small groups of neighbors stood outside the clubhouse doors whispering to each other. Some of them glanced toward me as Andre and I walked past, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and quiet support. The rumors had clearly spread. Inside the building, every chair was filled. People lined the walls and stood near the back of the room, talking in low voices. The hum of conversation bounced off the ceiling like a restless crowd waiting for a trial to begin. At the front of the room sat the HOA board table. And at the center of it all, perfectly composed as always, was Victoria Halberg. She looked completely at ease. Dressed in a dark blazer, hair perfectly styled, posture straight as a judge behind a courtroom bench. A stack of papers sat neatly in front of her. Beside her stood Marcus Doyle from Summit Ridge Community Services. Marcus wasn't sitting with the board tonight. He was standing, arms crossed, watching the room with the quiet confidence of someone who believed everything was already under control. When Victoria noticed me enter, her eyes locked onto mine for a moment. Then she gave a faint smile. The kind of smile someone gives when they're convinced the ending has already been written. Andre and I took seats near the center of the room. A few minutes later, the meeting began. Victoria tapped the microphone lightly. The room fell silent. "Good evening, residents of Pine Hollow Ridge," she said smoothly. "Thank you for attending tonight's meeting." Her voice carried easily across the room. "For those unaware," she continued, "tonight we will be addressing ongoing compliance issues involving several recently annexed Ridge properties." I felt dozens of eyes turn toward me. Victoria flipped open the folder in front of her. "Despite repeated notices," she said, "one property owner has refused to correct multiple architectural violations." She didn't say my name. She didn't need to. "After months of non-compliance," she continued, "the board is now prepared to move forward with enforcement action to protect our community standards." Marcus Doyle stepped forward slightly. "In accordance with Pine Hollow Ridge bylaws," he announced, "the board will now present a motion authorizing foreclosure proceedings against the non-compliant property located on Ridge Parcel 17. That was my land. The cabin. The home I had built, board by board, with my own hands." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Victoria raised a hand for silence. "Mr. Calder was given multiple opportunities to bring his property into compliance," she said. "Unfortunately, he has refused every reasonable request." Andre shifted beside me. I could feel the tension building in the room like a tightening wire. Then someone stood up near the back. Lydia Cross. She walked calmly toward the front of the room, carrying a slim, leather briefcase. "Madam President," she said evenly, "before this vote proceeds, I request the opportunity to present new information relevant to the board's authority over the Ridge parcels." Victoria's expression barely changed. "I'm afraid the agenda has already been set," she replied. Lydia didn't move. "This information concerns the legality of the annexation vote that expanded Pine Hollow Ridge's jurisdiction," she said. That got people's attention. Several residents leaned forward in their chairs. Victoria glanced briefly at the other board members. For the first time, I noticed something subtle. Two of them looked uncertain. The room had gone completely quiet. Victoria straightened in her seat. "We are not reopening that matter tonight," she said firmly. But the hesitation was already spreading. Someone near the back spoke up. "Maybe we should hear it." Another voice followed. "Yeah. Let her talk." The pressure in the room shifted. Victoria's confident posture tightened slightly. That was the moment I stood up. I walked slowly toward the front of the room, holding the folder Andre and I had spent 2 weeks building. Documents, vote records, emails, everything Lydia had helped us uncover. Victoria watched me approach with that same calm smile still on her face. In her mind, this was still her meeting, her room, her authority. She believed the foreclosure vote would end the problem tonight. I reached the board table and set the folder down. Victoria leaned back in her chair, clearly amused. "Mr. Stays." "Calder," she said lightly, "unless you plan to present something relevant, I suggest you take your seat so we can proceed with the vote." Marcus Doyle crossed his arms behind her. The entire room held its breath. Victoria lifted her hand to call the foreclosure vote. But before she could speak, I opened the folder and slid the annexation records across the table. Then I looked directly at her and said 5 words that stopped the room cold. The vote count was impossible. For a moment after I said the words, the room went completely still. Victoria Halberg stared down at the documents I had slid across the table. The vote count was impossible. She frowned slightly, as if I had just spoken a language she didn't recognize. Marcus Doyle leaned forward and picked up the first page. His eyes scanned the numbers quickly. Total votes cast, 75. Total homes in Pine Hollow Ridge, 74. Around us, residents began whispering. Victoria cleared her throat and tried to regain control. "I'm not sure what point you think you're making, Mr. Sane." "Calder," she said coolly, "but this meeting is about compliance violations, not—" "Actually," Lydia Cross said calmly from behind me, "it's very much about that." She stepped forward and placed her briefcase on the table beside the documents. "Because if the annexation vote that brought the ridge parcels into Pine Hollow Ridge was fraudulent," she continued, "then the HOA has no authority over those properties at all." The whispers grew louder. Victoria's smile faded slightly. "That's an accusation," she said sharply. "It's a calculation," Lydia replied. She turned the document so everyone in the front row could see it clearly. "The official meeting minutes show 75 votes were cast in favor of annexation," she explained. "However, Pine Hollow Ridge only had 74 homes eligible to vote at the time." She paused. "You cannot legally have more votes than voters." The room erupted. People leaned toward one another, pointing at the paper. Conversations broke out across the room as homeowners began realizing what that number meant. Victoria slammed her hand lightly against the table. "Order," she snapped. But Lydia wasn't finished. She opened another folder. "There's also the matter of financial incentives," she said. Marcus Doyle stiffened. Lydia slid several printed documents across the table. "These are management contract records between Pine Hollow Ridge and Summit Ridge Community Services." She tapped one paragraph. "According to this agreement, Summit Ridge receives 10% of all enforcement fines issued by the HOA." The murmuring turned into open outrage. A man near the back stood up. "You mean every fine we pay sends money to that company?" "Yes," Lydia said calmly. "And when the HOA expanded its boundaries to include the ridge parcels, the number of properties subject to fines increased dramatically." Several heads turned toward Marcus Doyle. His confident posture suddenly looked less comfortable. "This is speculation," he said quickly. "Our company simply enforces the board's rules." "Of course," Lydia replied, "but there's one more detail." She lifted another document. "The HOA president who oversaw the annexation vote 2 years ago now works for Summit Ridge Community Services." The room exploded. Angry voices rose from every corner. "Are you serious? You're kidding. That's corruption." Victoria's face had turned rigid. "This meeting will remain civil," she said sharply. But before she could continue, another voice spoke up. "Actually, Lydia's right." The crowd parted slightly as Rachel Alvarez stood up from the third row. Rachel walked toward the front, holding a small stack of printed emails. I saved these messages from before the annexation vote, she said. She placed them on the table. They're from the HOA board urging residents to vote for expansion. Lydia picked up the pages and read one line aloud. Homeowners who oppose this expansion may face compliance reviews in the future. Gasps rippled through the room. Rachel folded her arms. That sounded like pressure back then, she said. Now it sounds like a threat. Marcus Doyle stepped forward quickly. This is all circumstantial, he said. There's no proof the vote itself was manipulated. That's when another voice spoke from the back of the room. A calm, steady voice. There might be. The crowd turned. An older man with silver hair stood near the rear wall, Walter Kane. Most residents recognized him immediately. Walter was a retired county magistrate who had been asked earlier in the year to serve as an independent election monitor for HOA meetings. He walked slowly toward the front of the room. I reviewed the original annexation documents this afternoon, he said. He stopped beside the board table and looked directly at Victoria. The vote count is irregular, he continued calmly. And under Pennsylvania property law, that discrepancy alone is enough to trigger a legal challenge. The room went silent again. Victoria's composure finally cracked. This meeting is adjourned, she said abruptly, rising from her chair, but Walter Kane didn't move. I'm afraid it isn't, he said. Victoria froze. Walter gestured toward the packed room. There is a legal quorum present tonight, he explained, which means the membership has the right to continue the meeting and address board leadership. Andre stepped forward beside me. So let's do that, he said. A wave of agreement moved through the crowd. Within minutes, nominations began. Residents who had spent the last 2 weeks learning about the annexation and the fines stood up and volunteered to run for the board. Andre, Rachel Alvarez, Martin Keller, 2 other longtime homeowners who had quietly supported us during the investigation. Victoria sat silently as the ballots were handed out. The vote took less than 10 minutes. When Walter finished counting them, he stood up and cleared his throat. All 5 reform candidates have been elected, he announced. A roar of applause filled the room. Then Walter looked down at the remaining tally sheet. Victoria Halberg received 11 votes. Just 11. For a woman who had ruled Pine Hollow Ridge like it was her personal kingdom. Victoria didn't say another word. She simply gathered her papers and walked out of the clubhouse. Marcus Doyle followed shortly behind her. The moment the door closed, Andre leaned toward the new board table. So, he said, what's the first order of business? Rachel Alvarez looked at the others. Then she smiled. I move that Pine Hollow Ridge immediately terminate its contract with Summit Ridge Community Services. Martin Keller raised his hand. I second that motion. The vote was unanimous. Just like that, the company that had tried to fine us out of our homes was fired on the spot. The weeks after that meeting moved faster than anything that had happened before. Once the new board took control of Pine Hollow Ridge, the entire situation began unraveling quickly. The first thing they did was file a formal legal challenge against the annexation vote that had pulled the Ridge parcels into the HOA. Lydia Cross handled the case, presenting the same evidence we had shown at the meeting. The impossible vote tally, the emails pressuring residents, and the financial connection between the former HOA president and Summit Ridge Community Services. The court didn't take long to respond. Within a few weeks, the judge issued a ruling that confirmed what we had suspected all along. The annexation vote had been conducted improperly. 75 votes from 74 homes wasn't just a clerical mistake, it was enough to invalidate the entire expansion. With that single decision, Pine Hollow Ridge lost any legal authority over the Ridge properties. My land. Andre's land. Martin Keller's place down the hill. Every parcel that had been dragged into the HOA through that vote was immediately released from its control. But that wasn't the only outcome. Because once the annexation was voided, something else became obvious. All of the enforcement actions based on that expansion were now invalid too. Every fine issued against Ridge homeowners was erased. My violation notices disappeared. Andre's greenhouse agricultural violation vanished. Martin Keller's shed demolition warning was officially withdrawn. Thousands of dollars in penalties that had been hanging over our heads simply ceased to exist. Meanwhile, Summit Ridge Community Services found themselves facing a very different kind of attention. Once the management contract was terminated, several homeowners began asking deeper questions about the company's enforcement practices. Records showed that Summit Ridge had collected a percentage of violation fines across multiple communities. And now that Pine Hollow Ridge had exposed the annexation scheme, state regulators began looking into whether similar tactics had been used elsewhere. Marcus Doyle's company suddenly had far bigger problems than one mountain HOA contract. As for Victoria Halberg, she disappeared from the neighborhood almost as quickly as she had tried to dominate it. 2 weeks after the court ruling, a small real estate sign appeared on her lawn. A month later, the house was sold. Nobody threw a party when she left. But the quiet sense of relief across Pine Hollow Ridge was impossible to miss. The new HOA board wasted no time cleaning things up. Andre Whitaker, Rachel Alvarez, Martin Keller, and the other elected members began rewriting several of the association's policies. The biggest change was immediate. All management contracts that rewarded companies based on enforcement fines were eliminated. From that point forward, HOA management would be paid a flat administrative fee, not a percentage of penalties, which meant no one had a financial incentive to create violations anymore. And just like that, the constant flood of warning letters stopped. Andre's greenhouse stayed exactly where it had always been. Martin Keller kept his shed. Other homeowners who had been dealing with minor compliance threats suddenly found those issues quietly dropped. And my cabin? It remained exactly the way I built it. Solar panels on the roof. Rainwater tanks beside the shed. Cedar siding glowing warm in the afternoon sunlight. Months later, Pine Hollow Ridge held its first real community gathering since the whole conflict ended. It happened at the same clubhouse where the showdown had taken place. This time, the mood couldn't have been more different. Tables of food filled the room. Neighbors who had barely spoken before were laughing together. Kids ran around outside while people shared stories about the chaos that had nearly torn the neighborhood apart. Andre raised a glass during the evening and said something that made everyone laugh. Turns out the best way to improve property values, he joked, is getting rid of corruption. But he wasn't wrong. For the first time since I had moved to Ridgeline Falls, the Ridge actually felt like a community, not a battlefield. Later that evening, I drove back up the dirt road to my cabin. The sky was turning orange as the sun dropped behind the mountains. I sat down on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the last light fade through the trees. The solar batteries hummed quietly behind the wall. Rainwater trickled through the filtration system, the same simple systems that Victoria Halberg had once claimed damaged community harmony. I thought about everything that had happened. The threats, the fines, the patrol trucks, the foreclosure vote that nearly took my home away. All of it built on paperwork, pressure, and the assumption that nobody would challenge the people in charge. But in the end, something stronger had happened. Neighbors started asking questions. People stopped being afraid of authority that didn't deserve it. And when enough voices spoke up together, the entire system that tried to control the Ridge collapsed. I leaned back in the chair and watched the last of the sunlight disappear over the valley. They tried to control my home with fear and paperwork. But in the end, the community took its power back. And my cabin still runs on sunshine and rainwater. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?